Do you think he's doing it on purpose? Jesus, do you think he's going out of his way to annoy people on purpose? I'm just asking, because actually that's been on my mind a lot lately. But you read this story, and it appears as though Jesus is doing things, and the disciples are doing things on the Sabbath, and it annoys the authorities. But it kind of appears like he's doing it on purpose. And if they were picking the heads off the grain, okay, so they were collecting grain. What are the guys going to do with it? In the first century, those guys wouldn't have known how to do anything with that. Some of them were fishermen, some of them, one was a tax collector, they had other jobs, but how would they have known what to do with a bunch of grain? They would have had to get somebody else, or they might have sold it. Either way, they're working. It's almost like they knew they were being watched, and they did it on purpose. Jesus goes into the temple and heals somebody on the Sabbath. Knowing, it's almost like he's going, are they looking? Are they looking? Are they looking? Okay, come over here. Are they looking? Trying to make sure that he's being seen to do it. And then it even says, Mark says, Jesus gets annoyed. He gets mad about it. It's almost like this whole story is like he's spoiling for a fight. Do you think he is? Why not? If not, why not? Where's the line between, is there one, between Jesus just doing what we should do and challenging on purpose? It's an interesting aspect of this story because it raises the question of whether or not Jesus was intentionally going out of his way to cause trouble. Do you think he was? Not Jesus, no. He doesn't get mad either. Right? But he does. And so I just say it's a really interesting way of addressing some of these stories of Jesus. Is Jesus actually just going about being Jesus, like we often describe the story, and how it's an example of how we should live? So is this story an example of how we should live? We should go out of our way to court controversy and try and challenge the authorities? Well, of course we should. Let's all go do that. No, of course not. It's a little on my mind lately because I've said some things lately that have caused some controversy. But I said them simply to say them. Because I think they need to be said. So where's the line, though? You might remember a couple of weeks ago I was talking about that whatever you say, it still has to be heard. And are you aware of how what you're being said is being heard? In fact, how can you be necessarily? Because there's a bunch of people in the room right now, there's a bunch of people watching right now, who all are hearing what I'm saying slightly differently. Am I in fact trying to be controversial? Or am I simply trying to live and say and talk and relate what I think Jesus is about? Does it matter? Does it? I just have questions. I don't really have any answers for those. But we need to think about that. We do need to think about that, because in just a moment I'm going to say something that's going to cause you to think about that. We do need to think about that. We need to be aware that sometimes the stories that we read of Jesus, we read these lovely stories of Jesus doing lovely things and wonderful things, but we also need to be aware that there were other people in that story, in the shadows of the side of that story, who aren't happy about what's going on, and perceive Jesus as going out of his way to challenge the order of things. There's even stories that have Jesus saying, I am going out of my way to challenge the order of things. So how does that affect our understanding of the story? Does it affect our understanding of the story in any way? Does it give us an example of how we might tell a story or relate a story in order to challenge the status quo, the order of things. Here's a thought. So this story is, of course, about something that occurs on the Sabbath, and to back that up, we have a passage from Deuteronomy, which is, in fact, the fourth commandment, and it can be the third or fourth commandment, depending on which sort of Christian denomination you are, because some number it differently. But it's the commandment about the Sabbath. So the idea is that the Sabbath is a day of rest. It's the seventh day, right? In Exodus, it's quite clear that the reason for having the Sabbath on the seventh day is because God labored 6 days in creation, and on the seventh day God rested, so we should too. And that makes perfect sense. So let's be absolutely clear, biblically speaking, the Sabbath is Saturday. It is not Sunday. That's right. The Jews, Seventh-day Adventists, and some Eastern churches are right. It's Saturday, is the Sabbath. Technically speaking, we're going to come back to that in a second too, but technically speaking, it is the seventh day. The reason many other denominations think it's the Sunday is because, first of all, when the first followers of Jesus, who were good Jews, were doing their thing initially, they would go to synagogue on Saturday and then have their celebration on the first day. Right? Remember the story of Mary and the women go to the tomb on the first day of the week. It's the day of resurrection. It makes perfect sense that we would have a celebration on the first day of the week, the day of the resurrection. But it's not the Sabbath. The Sabbath is still the seventh day because 6 days God labored, and on the seventh day, right? So we started having our thing on the first day, and then this is way more complicated than this, but a combination of we started to focus more on that kind of stuff, and the more traditional Jews started to go, hey, you guys are focusing more on your own thing, go and do that and stay the heck out of our synagogues now. So it became the first day was the day. And then, you remember Constantine, the guy who caused all the problems? Constantine in 321 determined that the day of the sun, the first day of the week, will be the day of rest. The same guy who brought Christianity as the religion of the state determined that Sunday would now be the day of rest. You can see how we then immediately started to think that Sunday was the Sabbath. But it's not, it's Saturday. And yet, he's got a point. Because if you are speaking just technically in terms of biblically the story of 6 days and resting on the seventh day, you're absolutely right. Saturday is the Sabbath. Presuming, of course, that you consider Sunday to be the first day. But if that's the case, then Saturday is very definitely the Sabbath. And let's be clear about Sabbath, too. Sabbath is not midnight to midnight. For Jews, Sabbath starts at sundown on Friday, and it goes until, this is really kind of fascinating because I'm not really sure how they actually figured this out if it's cloudy, but it goes to the appearance of 3 stars on Saturday night. Once you can see 3 stars in the sky on Saturday night, Sabbath is over. Okay, so that's Sabbath. And we, of course, we always think a day is midnight to midnight, right? Or sunrise to sundown. So you can see how this is all contributing to the confusion of what actually is Sabbath. But technically, it's Saturday. It's the seventh day. Except, that's assuming you're just going to stick with that particular understanding of what Sabbath is. The day of rest that is determined by the creation story being 6 days and God resting on the seventh day. What if there was more to it, though? What if there was more to it? What if there was more to the idea of Sabbath than it being a specific set-apart period of time? One of the things that makes me think this so strongly is that I was meeting the other day where a Seventh-day Adventist pastor was talking about what happens on the Sabbath. And he actually said, it's such an active day. What? But the Sabbath is supposed to be a day of rest, to do nothing. but it's such an active day. So clearly, and don't get me wrong, I think I'm so happy he said that, because he makes the most important point about it, is that Sabbath isn't just sitting around doing nothing. It isn't. In fact, what it's become is a combination of, for most churches, what it's become is a combination of worship or a gathering of some kind and a time of rest. Right? But it's become the day of ritual, in other words. Right? Again, using the term Sabbath to mean the technical, this is the day piece, right? But the thing about that is, all of that activity that he was talking about is centered around gathering as a community to meet with God. And that's the thing about saying, oh, it's a day for rest. That means you do nothing. But you can't do nothing. I mean, realistically, think about it. Even when you're sleeping, you're physically resting, whether your mind is or not. Your body is trying to. You can't actually do nothing. Well, you can. You'd be dead. I mean, really, think about it. You can't actually do. You'd have to stop breathing. The essence of life. Right? So, you've got to be doing something. Okay, so when is it rest and when is it just doing nothing? Well, see, it's rest. I think it's rest if it's refreshing and it renews you. It inspires you when you then sort of to get going again. Right? It's the time, and it might be some sleep, but it might also be reading a book, right? Or playing a game, or doing any of those other things that might be life-giving to you. That can create a Sabbath moment. As long as you're aware that when you're doing those things, you're connecting. Right? Because one of those things that refreshes and renews you is the connection, and this is why we gather here. It's a moment to experience, to have a shared experience of God. To understand not just that it's a time set apart, or that it's time for rest, or it's a time for ritual, but it's also a time for our spirits, essentially, to be refreshed by reconnecting, by being re-inspired. Is that even a word? You know what I mean. Inspired by God. By an engagement with God, a moment with God. A God moment. That's why we have these places that we call sacred and holy. Because we've set them apart for that purpose. Which is great, don't get me wrong. That's absolutely super. It's 100% important. But it doesn't mean that this is exclusively the only place. If God is in all creation, then all creation is sacred. That means we can have that holy experience anywhere. So let's all just go out on the street here. We're just going to stand in the middle of the street right here. Everyone come with? No? You're not going to come with? Okay. You're thinking to yourself, cars and trucks will not think that they're having a holy experience, right? They'll just, okay. But that's the thing, is that it's not just about one place or one time or one moment. You can't just kind of say, in order to have a Sabbath experience, you must be in church or a sacred place on Saturday or Sunday or whatever day that you want to label. Because it's more than that. And I know it's more than that for two reasons. Number one is, there's two statements of this commandment. And the one statement of this commandment in Exodus, it concludes with, you should remember the Sabbath because 6 days God labored in creation, on the seventh day God rested. So you should have rest too. But it's restated in Exodus, and it doesn't say that. It doesn't say 6 days God labored and on the seventh day you should rest. That's why there's a Sabbath commandment. It says, you should rest on the seventh day because you were once slaves in Egypt and now you are not. You are free. In other words, part of the Sabbath, I think part of the Sabbath isn't just about structure, it's about freedom. It's about the freedom to observe it. The freedom to choose to observe it. Not simply because I told you you should, but because you have the freedom to do so. That means you have the freedom to choose that moment. You have the freedom to make that moment yourself. See, that's the thing about holy and sacred, is that the very first part of the commandment, whether it's in Exodus or Deuteronomy, the very first part of it says, remember or observe in Exodus, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. There are lots, none of them are here, of course, but I'm sure there are lots of people in churches on a Sunday morning who are not keeping the Sabbath holy. Because they're going to walk out of the church and it's not going to have made any difference to them at all in terms of how the week goes. It's just something that they do. But when we gather together and have some kind of an experience of God, a moment of holiness, that's something else. That's a moment of experiencing, I think that's a moment of experiencing not just the rest part, not just the freedom part, but the awareness that we are connected. Not just to each other, but to the earth, to all of creation, to the universe, to God. It's that moment of holiness is that moment of experiencing that oneness, that wholeness, spelling it differently, W-H-O-L-E, wholeness that refreshes us and renews us and helps us move forward. That's what Sabbath is about for me. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with Sabbath is a Saturday, or even the idea that Sabbath is a Sunday. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the idea that Sabbath means you should take a break and rest. It means, to me, that you should find the moment of holiness. That moment of holiness might be happening for you right now. It might be happening because you've nodded off some time ago. It might be because you're not really listening to me, you're actually thinking what you're going to do this afternoon and how cool that's going to be. And that's absolutely fine. That's my point. Is I can't manufacture a moment of holiness for you. No amount of telling people you must gather in a specific building at a specific time of day on a specific day in order to have a moment of holiness, no amount of doing that will make it happen. You make it happen. What makes this place sacred isn't that we commanded it to be so. It's that in all of the sacredness of creation, you have gathered here. That's what makes it holy. People talk about this. I've had this experience. Anybody ever been to Salisbury Cathedral in England? There's a place near there that's called Sarum, which is where the original cathedral was, and it was it's an ancient settlement. Like, it goes back to Iron Age and stuff. It's one of those places where the moment you stand there, you are aware that you are standing on holy ground. Not because somebody told you it was holy, but because you know thousands, millions of people have passed there through thousands of years. It has been a place of gathering. It has been a place of people experiencing holiness together for thousands of years. You can have those experiences. You can have those experiences in Alberta, right? There are traditional First Nations lands where you even just standing there, you know people have been here. You can't even begin to guess how long ago, but this is a place of sacredness. And what makes it so is that people gather there to experience this together. It's not because somebody said, oh, look, there's a spot on the map that says this is Holy Mountain or something. It's because you experience it. And you experience it because you experience it. I can't manufacture that for you. But if you walk into some of those places, some people have that experience of going into cathedrals or churches in Europe. Some people have it going to places in like those ancient sites in Mexico or in the Middle East or in South America. Places where people have gathered for thousands of years for a particular purpose. and you can feel it. You can. If they had not gathered there, you would not. It needs you. To remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy doesn't simply require someone commanding you to think or understand a certain way, or to even assemble in a certain way, or to behave in a certain way. It requires you to choose to make that moment happen. So you need to, is what I would say to you. You need to. Because that moment of holiness has a purpose. And that purpose isn't just, it's a moment of holiness. That purpose is, that moment of holiness translates into your life forward. How you go forward. It's why some people, and I know you're going to find this hard to believe, but this is true. Some people actually leave church on a Sunday morning refreshed and renewed and ready to start the week. I used to actually say that really sarcastically. Now I know it's absolutely true. I don't know who you are, but there's someone here who is. No, you do, but that's why we do it. And if we're not doing that, we're either doing something wrong or we shouldn't do it. Because that's the point. Creating a moment of holiness that refreshes and renews and moves us forward. There are so many ways to do that. One of them is for us to gather as a community. One of them is for us to gather as a community at a specific time on a Sunday morning and sit in pews. Another might be for us to gather as a community at a specific time, maybe sit in the pews, but do this a little bit differently, say like on a Monday night and call it Contemporary Church. Another way might be for us to gather and create story on the stage here. Another way might be for us to gather to knit or have coffee or have a Bible study. There are so many ways in which we gather as a community that can create those moments. And they create those moments because you are a part of it with God. That's what makes the moment holy. That's what makes this place holy.